So I'd like to start by saying, in terms of like doing something like this, like anytime that I've spoken on recovery or with addiction, like in the last so many months, like it really starts after you get a year clean and sober that you get asked to speak. You have to have a year to give your lead at meetings or to go into rehabs or to go into homeless shelters or psych wards. I've spoken at all those. And anytime I've done it, it's kind of been like within the recovery community. And I see like a lot of people in recovery who are pretty vocal, and they say we recover out loud, like basically on Facebook or Instagram, and I don't really do that. I'm not saying that it's because I'm ashamed of being in recovery, because I'm not, or that I was an addict. But it's more so because I think that maybe sends a message like, look at me, I'm clean and I'm doing so great. But this for me today is different because I see it as an act of service to reach a listener that might be struggling or have a family member that's struggling, because, addiction's so rampant in America and in the world that you either know somebody that's dealing with it or you're dealing with it yourself. You know what I mean? Whether it be drugs or like other addictions like you spoke of. So this was a good opportunity for me to kind of step outside of the 12-step fellowship and the recovery community and Narcotics Anonymous, and which is the fellowship that I go to, and kind of reach like more everyday listeners and stuff like that. So I want to clarify, why this is a cool opportunity for me. But in regards to your question about that stuff, man, it's like, I'll start by saying this. Like, I go to NA mainly for my recovery. That's where my sponsor is. That's where the people that I've got linked up with. Definitely had issues with alcohol, but it didn't bring me to my knees like narcotics, like drugs did. So NA just seemed like the appropriate place to go for me. But when it comes to AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, which most people have heard of, and the founders of the 12 steps, my point that I'm getting at is that when you tell me the story of the people in the neighborhood with all the bottles of beer and this and that, and you ask, it's a nice neighborhood, most people in here are probably successful and professionals, and they're drinking, and does that justify their addiction or their drinking or their drug use because they're accepted in society? What I've been taught in recovery is that social acceptability does not equal personal recovery. You know what I mean? Because since you're doing good on the outside, it doesn't really give you like a pass to go do whatever you want. Tying it back into the AA thing, what happens is in AA, specifically with alcohol, people tend to get clean and sober much later in their life because it's so accepted and it's a part of their daily routine, and they might go out with Cohen, might be a lawyer, but they go out to the bar every single day after work. I know people who do that. And it kind of just, spirals out of control. Maybe it doesn't, but it's just kind of like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, but it's not a good thing either, but with narcotics and with addicts compared to alcoholics, which let me clarify is the same exact thing. It's just different substance. In NA, there's a reading that talks about alcohol as a drug. It's a liquid drug. We don't differentiate. We don't like mince words, like all inclusive. It's like the NA thing. It's a little more of an adapted version of AA. But people tend to get clean earlier because drugs bring you to your knees faster. They're not socially acceptable. You can't go out and do Percocet in public. You know what I mean? You can't go out and do heroin or cocaine like in public. I mean, you can have your small group of friends, but you hide it, So most people I see that get clean in NA, like my home group personally, in where I go, it's in Turtle Creek, and I'll protect the anonymity as I'm supposed to of some of the members. Sure. But there's guys there with 49 years is the most time clean. And I didn't understand that. In my very first meeting I went to, there was a guy there with like 33 years clean. And I'm like, what are you doing here? You know what I mean? Aren't you cured from this? Like, don't you move on? And what I learned was that although he's been clean so long, like the program gave him a life that he never had. And now it's about carrying the message to somebody like me. You know what I mean? Giving him a hug at the door when I'm just literally spiritually broken, like almost, like dying really is how bad I was. And I didn't understand that, but I think that with drugs compared to alcohol, it happens quicker because you're brought to your knees faster, and you're likely to die quicker, as to where alcohol is more of like a slow process. Yeah. And I think plenty of your neighbors, are they, typical diagnosable addict, substance use disorder? I'm not sure. But do they probably justify it and drink more than they should because they've done well in life? Yeah. So hopefully that answers like that kind of question. You know what I mean? With all the bottles and stuff like that. I thought it was funny when you said it was like, it's probably like good wine and high end spirits.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah, dude,
they feel better because they're drinking like cognac fucking.
Yeah, you're not walking by and seeing fucking Yellowtail in there, dude.
Chianti
Like,
wine.
I'm thinking, I'm like, damn, dude, that's a lot of money these motherfuckers are spending.
Yeah, it's
So then the question I have next
Sure.
is, and I don't know how, I guess to explain this, but what's the difference between an addict and somebody that has a bad habit?
great question. We talked a little bit about this yesterday,
Yeah,
and I thought a little bit more about it. You know, the way I described it to you and that I've described it to other people in the past, plus one more element I'm going to add into it, is that an addict compared to somebody with a bad habit, I've noticed usually drinks or uses to escape some sort of negative emotion towards themselves, you know, from whatever it might be, an abuse, or they just don't like themselves, or whatever the issue is stemming from. They usually are taking substances to, you know, get outside of themselves, to change the way that they feel. As to where somebody with a bad habit, like I was explaining, they drink or use to enhance their mood. They don't necessarily hate the way they feel. You know, and there's people in my family and people I see, friends that fall into this category. It's bad for your body. It's a bad habit. You know what I mean? But they like themselves. They're successful. They do well, but they drink to enhance their mood. You know, it takes them up a notch, and they look forward to that.
We've talked about this before, and we mentioned it in the first podcast, that there's a difference between escaping what you want to see less of and celebrating what you want to see more of.
That's good.
And we've talked about the dangers of escaping what you want to see less of, but we didn't touch on why sometimes it's dangerous to celebrate in excess. Maybe you can touch on how that can become over time problematic when, even though you're celebrating what you want to see more of, it could lead you down a dark path.
Well, yeah, I definitely will touch on that. And that kind of brings up the question, like, it's like the chicken or the egg. What comes first, the substance or the addict? You know what I mean? Is addiction deeply rooted in your brain? And from what I've learned about the science of it, the treatment center I went to last, Glen Bay, had somewhere in between a physician's assistant and a doctor. I forget what his title was. It talked about the neurology of addiction. And as I understood it more, you know, it's like a brain disorder. You know what I mean? And not to get too crazy into it, but are you born an addict or do you become one? You know, so somebody like that, who starts off just celebratory drinking or recreational cocaine use or smoking a lot of weed or whatever it might be, it might not be out of control, but they might become obsessed with that feeling of rewarding themselves. You know what I mean? And then it could turn into a major problem. You know what I mean? I don't think everybody, it's like a different path into addiction. What I've noticed that really separates the two, you know what I mean? That can really, like the normies, we call them in recovery, compared to an addict, is that an addict cannot stop once they start. Once they take the first one, they lose control. They lose the power of choice. Somebody like, you know, a family member that I'm thinking of, he's able to drink and he'll get messed up and have a great time, but he's able to put it down. You know, he won't need it the next day. You know, like when I go, it's like all or nothing. You know, I don't like, we convince ourselves, I've convinced myself during times that I've relapsed that I'm just going to take one. You know, I'm just going to take one, you know, and it's never gone that way. I lose control, you know, and it's a humbling thing to admit the powerlessness, you know what I mean, of it. And that's like what the first step is in recovery. But, you know, I think that the real issue is with somebody like Zach's described, that, you know, they become addicted to that reward for themselves. You know what I mean? It's like a delusion. It's like a justification. I earned this. I deserve this. As to where an addict's like full of guilt and shame. Like, I'm a terrible person. You know what I mean? They're hiding away. Most people who are going relapses they're hiding in a room because they've been introduced to recovery. They know they shouldn't be doing it. Therefore, they're ashamed. But somebody on the other end, they'll probably just convince themselves that they deserve it. Yeah. You know, and that can lead to, you know, just unmanageability in their life. You know, this is the way that I look at it. And that could lead someone into recovery. You know, it's like you described, like all different sorts of spectrums. Like some are sicker than others is something that they say in recovery. And You know, like I had a roommate at the 3-quarter house. I still live in sober living to this day. I've been there about 18 months and I'm currently looking to move out, which is exciting. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But I didn't rush it, man. I was like, I did everything statistically, outpatient, inpatient treatment, sober living is the best chance to stay clean.
Yeah.
Long-term recovery. I went that route. I was like, whatever it takes, you know what I mean? But my point is I've had roommates that were like, just like, Delunky was just like a pothead, you know what I mean? And they kind of bust his balls a little, you know, he kind of gets like busted out like, oh dude, you're an NA for weed, you know what I mean? But hey, like,
Hey, you can be addicted.
The third tradition of Narcotics Anonymous is the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop using. That's what it is. You don't have to, it says in our readings, we don't care what or how much you used, who your connections were, only what you want to do about your problem and how we can help. So whether you're a stoner that doesn't want to smoke anymore, but has trouble stopping, or you've been smoking crack and shooting heroin for 25 years, you get treated the same way. You know what I mean? The process and the steps are handled, you go through them in the same way. You know what I mean? So try not to compare and contrast, but you know, there are some that are worse off than others, you know what I mean? But it ranges. So I think my point is that you have to make the decision. You have to look yourself in the mirror and decide, am I an addict? Do I want to do something about my problem? What people do is what we talked a lot about yesterday, and so much of my work this time, they say that the 12-step program is an ego deflation process to where you think of yourself less, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And you think of others more, you know what I mean? You become less self-centered, more God-centered, more people-centered. And I think that, you know, what happens is that we want to say he's worse than me. I'm not as bad as him. You know what I mean? And that could prolong your problem, which is a real issue. But you compare to me or somebody else who did worse drugs and you just justify it for years and years.
Yeah. I mean, I could definitely see that in somebody that does have that outward success.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh,
Somebody
definitely.
that could have the outward success and be like, okay, yeah, I do drink a bottle of wine every night, but I own this successful business.
Yeah.
But, you know, I can still take my kids out to X, Y, and Z, but
sure.
I still have a good marriage. But in the end of the day, that's just justifying a behavior that they know is wrong.
Yeah.